To say Cyberpunk went through a difficult journey to get where it is today is an understatement. Cyberpunk wasn't marketed as a good game. It was set up as a generational masterpiece. A barrage of exciting E3 gameplay showcases, private screenings for journalists, made us believe Cyberpunk could fly. So when they released 8 out of 10 that had more bugs than a sewer, the internet ripped them apart. But with Phantom Liberty, this all changed. In this video, I will explain why Cyberpunk's first DLC, Phantom Liberty, is an example of perfect game design. But I won't break down every aspect of its winning formula with the obsessive level of autism most creators naturally excel in. Instead, I'll direct my autistic magic to analyze what I believe to be perhaps the most integral part of any game to the player's overall experience. Its opening. And I personally think there's no better way to explain the role an opening plays to our overall experience than by comparing an opening that sets up the game well versus an opening that doesn't. And what better example of false expectations than the volcanic shitstorm that was the base game launch of Cyberpunk 2077. To say Cyberpunk went through a difficult journey to get where it is today is an understatement. Nowadays, the internet has come to appreciate what Night City has to offer and to obsess less over where it comes short. But that was not the case at the time. You see, Cyberpunk wasn't marketed as a good game. It was set up as a generational masterpiece. A barrage of exciting E3 gameplay showcases, private screenings for journalists, not to mention the series of interviews with the enthusiastic and charismatic originator of the tabletop predecessor, made us believe Cyberpunk could fly. And it didn't hurt that CD Projekt Red were already the revolutionary rocker boys of the industry. They had emerged from the relative obscurity of Poland to create one of the best RPGs of the PS3 era, The Witcher 2, and arguably the best RPG of the PS4 era, The Witcher 3. And so when they released a decent 8 out of 10, not too bad, that had more bugs than a sewer, the internet ripped them apart. And for a good couple of years, their once immense reputation was in the mud. Some were won over by the updates they made to make, the game playable. Also, the fantastic success of Cyberpunk Edgerunners gave the game a tremendous boost, but the vision of Night City that was sold had still never been actually created. But with Phantom Liberty, this all changed. Universal distrust of CD Projekt Red was substituted for praise, and a renewed faith in their development abilities proliferated among reviewers and consumers. Now, why was it the case that Phantom Liberty was such an amazing success, and yet the base game of Cyberpunk 2077 never really lived up to the expectations that were set so tremendously from the beginning? Well, for me, this is where the opening comes into play. Think of openings as first impressions. Like in real life, they're kind of superficial, probably don't say much about the future, but set up expectations in our mind that are extremely hard to change. And so openings are not important for what they are, but for what they set up. The flow between the opening and the rest of the game is, for me, the most fundamental aspect of good game design. It can really make and break the experience of a player. A terrible opening sets up low expectations that require a tremendous shift for the better to change, and a great opening will set up an expectation for continual brilliance along the lines established by the opening. A famous example of this is Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII had one of the best openings in JRPG history, with a cinematic and stylistic flair seen in very few games. But this highly exciting and innovative opening was followed by a lackluster beginning, middle and end. And so many players slog through the rest of the game with a lingering feeling of disappointment. And I believe the situation with the Cyberpunk 27 base game versus the DLC mirrors the treatment of Final Fantasy XII. Now you might be thinking it, Cyberpunk 2077 had a great opening, and I'd agree with you. I'm not saying that Cyberpunk had a bad opening, but as with Ozymandias, its greatness begot its downfall. This is because it set up many unfulfilled expectations for the player. Did Night City in the end provide the constant dose of cinematic high-octane action, or have the level of depth that the opening and marketing materials made us feel as though it would? No. Was the gameplay loop driven forward by the acute sense of desperation that the introduction of a ticking time bomb sets up? No. And above all else, did Night City feel dynamic and lived in? No. Unlike Novigrad, Tucson, Skellige, or even Oxenfurt, I can barely remember the various districts of Night City, because great moments in the Cyberpunk base game remain just that, moments. And that's where the DLC differs, and why I believe it is a masterpiece. It doesn't diverge from the promise of the Cyberpunk formula established by the opening, the marketing material, so on and so forth, but it takes the good parts, refines them, and spreads their magic across the entire tapestry to create a consistently brilliant experience. And in the process, produces a loop that from start to finish drips with the immense promise of base game Cyberpunk. I'll explain how. In many ways, Phantom Liberty is very familiar. Much like the base game, it immediately establishes existential stakes for V's involvement in the story. It also very explicitly establishes that things are not as they seem. Danger is everywhere and no one can be trusted at face value. A perfect microcosm of the corporatized dystopia of Night City that the Cyberpunk base game promised us. But why does it work where the base game doesn't? Well, for me, its true strength lies in how its pacing threads into the core gameplay experience of the player. You see, the story starts off fairly slow. Instead of dramatic sequences unrepresentative of the actual experience of navigating Dogtown, the player is slowly eased into the plot through the setting, not the other way around. I'll explain what I mean. After covertly making their way into Dogtown through a dangerous hidden passage, the player is not immediately sent to the crash site, but instead emerges in a large dynamic market straight past the border. In doing so, the player gets an idea of what navigating Dogtown actually feels like. And not to spoil too much, but it's great. I remember when I first arrived in this border market and was immediately pleasantly surprised by how dynamic and alive it felt. Of conversing strangers and sounds of hustle and bustle abounded. Not only did this break my base game brain and make me actually want to speak to vendors, but when I did so, I was rewarded with interesting and unique dialogue. I'll never forget the genuine glee I experienced when I went up to chat with a vendor and suddenly, oh shit, fire. But the genius of the introduction doesn't end there. By situating this level of dynamism within Dogtown, it doesn't just set up high expectations, but ensures that they can be consistently met by the world. And this is where the base game of Cyberpunk went wrong, and where Phantom Liberty excels. By threading the opening into the main narrative, players are given a consistently stellar experience, versus the more patchy, inconsistent, unrealized base game. The soundtrack, real-time cutscenes, and consistent dynamism of Dogtown create something key to any strong sci-fi gaming experience. Atmosphere. Atmosphere is what allows you to suspend disbelief and become truly engaged in the simulation. And Phantom Liberty has this key ingredient in bounds. The tense, pulsing soundtrack and intimate in-game cutscenes create a world that feels as though it was viscerally dripping with the cold, isolated terror of neo-noir sci-fi. Think of Deus Ex Human Revolution with more than one color palette. For me, the casino scene stands out in particular. Even though your gamer mind tells you that the mission will go through without any issues, the repeated moments of tension send the opposite signals. Questions like, has Reed been captured? Will they suddenly leave, endangering your mission? And do they know what you're doing? Swirl through your mind constantly. And miraculously, these thoughts almost fuse with yours like a cybernetic entangling of your minds. And it ends with a bang. And that ending should be experienced by you guys. So I'm not going to go any further, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe.